Hello, and welcome to Mini Lecture E, Warrant. This map of the 6 primary components of the Toulmin method of argumentation has motivated our mini lectures thus far. In week 1, we introduced the method and the first primary component, the conclusion. Then we took a good long look at evidence in week 2. Much of what we said also applied to backing, since backing is essentially evidence for your evidence, or evidence for your warrant. This week we study warrant, which will conclude our survey of the major components of the Toulmin method across the top of the diagram. We'll say a few words about qualifiers and rebuttal along the way, and in week 6 we'll say a lot about rebuttal. As we learned last week, there are 2 tests for a good argument, called the evidence test and the warrant test. The evidence test asks of the evidence, is it true? That is, does it fairly represent the way things are? Is it relevant? That is, does it have anything to do with the argument's conclusion? And is it sufficient? That is it enough to give the audience good reason to accept the conclusion? All this should sound pretty familiar. We just went over it last week. Now, the warrant test asks of the warrant, is it available? Is it agreeable? And is it truth conducive? We've noted before that the warrant often goes unstated in an argument. This is because it is usually assumed that the connection between the evidence offered and the conclusion derived is obvious and does not need to be explained. The question of availability, is the warrant available, asks if the warrant is indeed obvious. Will the audience be able to see naturally and without effort that the evidence, if true, gives us good reason to accept the conclusion? Or, if it seems clear that the warrant is not available to the audience without effort, the question of availability asks if the argument states the warrant clearly for the audience. So in order to be available, the warrant should be obvious or explicit. And if there is any doubt about whether or not it's obvious, it should be made explicit in the argument. Of course, it does no good for the warrant to be available to the audience if the audience doesn't happen to think that it is good warrant. If your audience is from a significantly different background in values, educational level, or a number of other ways, they may not agree that the warrant connections that seem so evident to you make any kind of connection at all between the evidence and the conclusion. An obvious example of this would be trying to use the axioms and theorems of calculus to prove a point to a 9th grade algebra student. Of course, any connection between evidence and conclusion supported by calculus will not be clear to the average 9th grader. It doesn't matter how well the evidence supports the conclusion if your audience does not understand the nature of that support. Not all logical and inferential connections are obvious. In fact, many are downright counterintuitive. So it may not be simply that your audience doesn't see the connections. They may even be inclined to deny that they are there. Now, we talked briefly about the concept of truth conduciveness in week 1. Perhaps the easiest way to understand it is to begin with the verb form of the word conducive, which is the verb to conduct. Good warrant conducts truth the same way good copper conducts electricity. It provides a clear and relatively uninterrupted path from one place to another. If the copper wire it's from one end of the wire to the other. If there's power at one end, there will be power at the other. In a good argument, the warrant conducts truth from the evidence to the conclusions. If there's truth at one end, there will be truth at the other. Now, it's important to note that truth conduciveness comes in degrees. Different types of warrant may be more or less truth conducive. In other words, given the warrant, the conclusion may be more or less likely true. The limiting case of this, as we'll see in a minute, is a mathematical proof. If it is true that A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then it is certain, with no room for doubt, that A is greater than C. A mathematical proof conducts truth in a way that the finest copper in the universe cannot, with 100% efficiency and no resistance or friction whatsoever. But, as we'll also see, most warrants are not like this. Most warrants are truth conducive to a greater or lesser degree. Obviously, the greater the conduciveness, the stronger the warrant, all other things being equal. Of course, truth conduciveness is the critical characteristic of warrant. But still, like the three conditions of the evidence test, the three conditions of the warrant test must all be met in order for the argument to pass it. Remember our calculus proofs in the 9th grade algebra class. Those proofs have that 100% truth conduciveness we were just talking about, but no one in the class is convinced of anything. So, we have two different tests, each of which has three conditions, and all three conditions must be met in order for an argument to pass either test. Furthermore, an argument must pass both tests in order to be a good argument. So determining whether or not an argument is a good argument, whether or not it should influence our thinking or our actions, it's a matter of properly evaluating the evidence and the warrant to determine, as best we can, whether or not they pass their respective tests. Now, last week we looked closely at different kinds of evidence that can be used in an argument. This week, we turn to warrant. The first thing to understand is that warrant is made up largely of principles of inference. Inference is the practice of deriving new knowledge from current knowledge. Have you ever put two and two together, as we sometimes put it? You think about two different things you know, and suddenly you realize something you didn't know. You inferred that new information from the old. You made an inference. For example, you know that your best friend Greg has a cousin named Elena. You also know that Elena's father is your dentist, Dr. William Parker. Then one day it dawns on you that your dentist is the Uncle Bill Greg is always talking about. This amuses you because you've always thought of Dr. Parker as very serious and no nonsense. But Greg's Uncle Bill sounds like a lot of fun. By putting together your knowledge of Greg's cousin and Elena's father to realize something you didn't know before, you have made an inference. Inferences come in patterns that can apply to any number of different arguments. These patterns are the principles I mentioned. And the fact that those principles are truth conducive is what enables us to convince our audiences of the truth of our conclusions. Now, if you tell me that Greg's Uncle Bill is your dentist, and I ask you, how do you know that? You simply need to explain the relationships to me, and I will immediately agree with you that Greg's uncle is indeed your dentist. Now, as principles, these inference patterns can usually be expressed in very general terms. In fact, warrant needs to be expressed as generally as possible in order to emphasize that the argument being presented is a single instance of a much broader and widely accepted mode of inference. Now, the second important thing to understand is that inferences come in two kinds, deductive and inductive. Now, I'm sure you've heard the distinction between deductive and inductive inference explained in other classes. Well, no disrespect to my colleagues, but it is my experience that most people who do not have philosophy degrees, like your effective and lovable professor does, they get the distinction wrong. The difference is not about general to specific versus specific to general or anything like that. The difference is about certainty versus probability. Let me explain to you what I mean. Deduction is about certainty. In other words, if the evidence is all true, the conclusion is certainly true. In other words, it is impossible in the strongest sense of the word for the conclusion to be false. Remember our math example a few minutes ago. If it is true that A is greater than B, and it's true that B is greater than C, then it is certain, with no room for doubt, that A is greater than C. No matter what A, B, and C are, if the first two statements are true, the third one has to be true. It's impossible for A to be greater than B and B greater than C, but for A to be less than or equal to C. So, in good deductive reasoning, the conclusion follows from the evidence without a shadow of a doubt, with no margin for error whatsoever. The two primary examples of this kind of reasoning are in mathematics, as we've just seen, and in what's called formal logic. If you've ever been in a class, geometry perhaps, where you've done proofs like this one, this is what I mean by formal logic. Now, as you might guess, very, very few of the arguments we encounter on a daily basis are grounded in mathematics or formal logic. So we're not really going to spend any time at all discussing the various forms of deductive inference. There's a lot of them, but we're not going to worry about them. Instead, we will turn our attention to induction is about likelihood, about probability. In other words, if the evidence is all true, the conclusion is very likely to be true, though there is always some possibility that it is false. The goal of a good inductive argument is to make that possibility as small as possible and the likelihood of the conclusion's truth as large as possible. That is to say, a good inductive argument proves the truth of the conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. While it is possible that the evidence is true and the conclusion is false, the rational thing to do is accept the conclusion as true and act accordingly. The vast, overwhelming majority of arguments that we offer and assumptions we make on a daily basis are inductive in nature. Virtually every conclusion we come to might be false, even if all the evidence we base it on is true. All historical arguments and beliefs about the past are inductive. Your belief that George Washington was the first president of the United States, or that Martin Luther King spoke at the March on Washington in 1963, even your memory of what you had for supper last night, are inductive inferences. Given the evidence you have, it is possible, though highly unlikely, that they are false. All scientific arguments and knowledge gained through our senses are inductive. Science is constantly growing and changing, which means scientists are constantly changing their minds about what truths the evidence shows. We have great faith in science, and rightly so. But we also recognize that current scientific understandings are incomplete at best and may one day be shown to be flat out false. All arguments offered in a court of law are inductive. Remember Trudy from week 1? We concluded that she was the murderer because her fingerprints were on the weapon and she had an argument with the victim. Well, it is certainly possible for both of these facts to be true, even though Trudy isn't the murderer. And attempts to prove guilt based on evidence are in the same boat. Even those that we deem conclusive are cut and dried. This is why the standard of evidence in a criminal court is beyond a reasonable doubt. If it were beyond a shadow of a doubt, no one would ever be convicted of anything. and beliefs we have about future events are based on inductive reasoning. It is always possible, no matter how unlikely, that the future will be completely new and unpredictable. It's not a law of logic or mathematics that the future must be like the past. This applies whether we're talking about what life will be like in the 23rd century or if we're just supposing that the sun will come up tomorrow morning. My belief that my car will start in a few minutes when I go out to meet my wife for supper is only probabilistically supported. It is possible, though unlikely, that it won't start, even though I know of absolutely no reasons why it wouldn't. Furthermore, I wouldn't be surprised when I go out to the garage and it does start. Indeed, I would be very surprised if it doesn't. The most common kinds of inductive warrant patterns have been codified into the acronym GASCAP. You should recognize every one of these. You use them all the time and accept them from others all the time. The G in GASCAP is for generalization. A generalization argument cites examples that reveal a predictable pattern and concludes that the pattern holds in general. If I've owned 4 Honda Accords and every one of them has gotten good gas mileage, I conclude that, in general, Accords get good gas mileage. The conclusions that generalizations support have qualifiers that reveal the extent to which the generalization is being made. That is, this is one of the most common and most important uses of qualifiers mentioned in the Toulmin method. Some of the most typical qualifiers are all, none, most, and few. And you could think of some others, I'm sure. So consider the argument: my fantasy league members love my Monday night football parties, and tonight's game decides who's going to the playoffs. So I expect that most of them will show up. I say most because, despite the evidence, they love my parties, tonight's game is really important, it's still doubtful that everyone will show up. Someone always has a reason why they need to be somewhere else. So there's reason to believe most will show up, but not really reason to believe that all will show up. The A is for analogy. An analogy is an argument by comparison, where known similarities between 2 or more objects, events, or situations are used to infer a further similarity. The Honda Accord has a lot in common with the Nissan Altima. Since many of these similarities are relevant to fuel economy, I can conclude that since the Accord gets good gas mileage, the Altima probably does too. The S is for sign, in the sense of clue or lead. This is the kind of reasoning they do on CSI or NCIS. It's the kind that Sherlock Holmes and Perry Mason used to do, for those of you closer to my age. These people are always piecing together hints and trace evidence to solve a mystery or support a hypothesis. This is a typical approach of investigators, such as detectives, medical examiners, and forensic experts. If someone steals my Honda Accord and the local detectives find a footprint, a dropped candy wrapper, and 3 threads from a jacket caught in the bark of a nearby tree, this may be all they need to hunt down the thief. The C is for we observe a typical sequence and infer that it indicates a causal connection. This one is trickier than you might think. We make assumptions about one thing causing another all the time. But it is important to remember that we never actually observe causation. All we ever observe is that one event happens and then another event happens right after it. The storm hits and our lights go out. Someone knocks at the door and the dog barks. If we observe this first A then B pattern often enough and in the right conditions, we then infer that A causes B. But we don't see the storm cause the lights to go out. There's no such thing as seeing that. There's nothing to see. Causation is always an inference, and it's an inductive inference at that. It's always possible that we're wrong. We can usually trust our instincts on causation inferences, but it is important to remember that it is an inference, not an obvious truth. The second A stands for authority. We've already seen that expert testimony is one of the most common forms of evidence. This is because we assume that a credible or reliable source offering testimony to a fact is good evidence for that source. Good evidence for that fact. The credible source may be a person, a book, a journal, a magazine, or a newspaper, a website or other online source, or any number of other information conduits. If my favorite mechanic at the Honda website or in the Chilton's manual tells me the noises I'm hearing indicate a worn belt, then I'd better get my belts checked as soon as possible. The P stands for principle. Principles are shared assumptions and values which lend support to given inferences. We've already noted that all warrant is a matter of shared assumptions of one kind or another. But here we're talking especially about shared assumptions regarding what's important or what's worth caring about. Remember that we listed shared values or goals as a type of evidence, particularly regarding conclusions of value or policy. Principle is the warrant that supports the inference from a certain set of evidence to the conclusion that we should adopt a certain value or policy. Okay, I know that was a whirlwind tour of warrant and your head is probably spinning right now. But don't panic. There's not going to be a test or any of this stuff requiring you to keep it all straight. Same thing goes for evidence. That's not how this class works. What's important here is that you are aware of these different categories of warrant so you can use them to help judge or evaluate whether or not an argument passes the warrant test. But wait, I just said the key issue here is to know how to judge or evaluate the warrant. We haven't really talked about that yet. Last week we learned about the PARSA test for evaluating evidence. 5 criteria that evidence must meet to a satisfactory level in order to be good evidence. Well, evaluating warrant doesn't require a whole new set of criteria like PARSA. Instead, all we need is one question. How easy would it be? That is, how easy would it be for all this evidence to be true, but the conclusion still be false? For example, let's get back to poor Trudy. How easy would it be for everything we know to be true? Her fingerprints are on the weapon. She had a quarrel with the neighbor yesterday. How likely is it, or how easy would it be for all of that to be true? And yet, she's not the murderer. Can you think of any way that this might be the case? Well, one might be this. Suppose Trudy was at the victim's house examining the weapon for some reason when they got in an argument and she put the gun down and left in a huff. Then, sometime later, another person came into the house wearing gloves, picked up the weapon, and killed the victim with it. Now, under this scenario, all the evidence is true. Trudy's fingers are on the weapon because she was handling it, and she did have an argument with the victim. Yet the conclusion is false. Trudy is not the murderer. How easy would it be for something like that to have happened? The answer to that question is the answer to how strong the warrant is. So the general rule of warrant evaluation is this. The easier it is to imagine an alternative story being true, the weaker the warrant is. So the more likely that it is that some alternative story is the actual story, then the less strong the warrant is. The more ways there are for the evidence to be true and the conclusion false. Now, the reverse of this, of course, is also true. The harder it is to imagine an alternative story being true, the stronger the warrant is. So, how easy would it be for this alternative Trudy story to be true? Well, to answer this question, we need to ask ourselves a few others. Like, how likely is it that Trudy and the victim would be sitting around looking at a weapon? Or how likely is it that someone else would have come by later? Who might that person be? Why would she or he have dropped by? Or even if a person did come by, how likely is it that that person would be wearing gloves? And even if a person did drop by wearing gloves and did pick up the gun and shoot the victim with it, how about this? How likely is it that those gloves wouldn't smear Trudy's fingerprints beyond recognition? It's questions like this that the detectives examining the case would be asking themselves constantly. And they would go out and find as much information as they could to help answer these questions. And the more or less likely the scenario became, the less or more likely it would become that Trudy was the murderer. Well, we don't usually have as much time or expertise as the detectives do in evaluating an argument's warrant, and it's usually not that important that we do have that kind of expertise. But there is a pattern here that we can follow to whatever extent is feasible. First, ask yourself the question, how easy would it be for all the evidence to be true, but the conclusion to be false? Second, think about the most obvious scenario to you where this is true. Write the scenario down, beginning with the word suppose and ending with the words, how likely would that be? Third, think of as many questions as you can that need to be answered before you can evaluate the likelihood of the alternative scenario. And finally, as you consider these questions, you will start forming a more intelligent opinion about how likely the alternative scenario is. And again, the more likely the alternative, the less likely the original scenario. The less likely the alternative, the more likely the original. So, once again, of warrant. The easier it is to imagine an alternative story being true, the weaker the warrant is. The harder it is to imagine an alternative story being true, the stronger the warrant is. Now, in the end, it's going to be a judgment call whether or not the warrant is strong enough to justify the conclusion. Oftentimes, this judgment call will be easy. The more you think about the alternative, the more obvious it will become to you whether the alternative is a good possibility or not. Sometimes it just won't be clear to us. We can't rule the alternative likely or unlikely. We just don't know how good it is. That's okay, but in those scenarios, we have to have the same view of the original argument. We're unclear about about the warrant, and we just don't know how good the argument is. The rational thing to do then is to suspend judgment about the argument and its conclusion. We just don't know. But the more practice you have in evaluating arguments, the better your judgment will become, and the easier it will be for you to make reliable judgments about the warrant. In critical thinking, as in everything else, practice makes perfect. Well, almost perfect anyway. This is induction after all. That completes our survey of the all-important top row of the Toulmin model. But before we move on to deeper aspects of this program, I wanted to give you a very helpful way to identify the conclusion, the evidence, and the warrant of the argument. If you aren't sure what the conclusion of the argument is, just ask the argument, okay, what's your point? The conclusion is the argument's whole reason for existence. It's the reason the argument is being offered, and because of this, every other sentence in the argument must point, either directly or indirectly, to the conclusion. Now, if you think you know the conclusion, but you realize that there are sentences that don't seem to be saying anything at all about your conclusion, that's a pretty good sign you haven't gotten to the conclusion yet. Let's return to this argument we saw in week 1. Notice that sentences 1 through 3 have to do with legal drugs, and sentences 4 through 7 have to do with alcohol. So if you pick any one of those as the conclusion, you will have the problem that there are several sentences that don't have anything to do with the subject of the conclusion. The first 3 aren't talking about alcohol, and the next 4 aren't talking about prescription and over-the-counter drugs. But one thing they all have in common is that they're all related in one way or another to marijuana. And the only sentence that isn't talking about marijuana and nothing else is sentence 8. This is the point. Everything else was said to get to this one claim. Marijuana should be legalized. This, by the way, is a conclusion of policy, just to reflect back on week 1. The conclusion is talking about a rule for behavior within a community of people. This is how we should all behave. We should allow the usage of marijuana among us. Well, now that we've identified the conclusion, we ask of the conclusion, how do you know that? How do you know that the conclusion is true? In other words, we are asking for evidence for the conclusion. What reasons does the arguer have for thinking that the conclusion is true? So back to our marijuana argument. We just saw that, in a way, all of the other sentences relate to the conclusion. But we notice something else. They fall naturally into 2 groups, the drugs group and the alcohol group. Wow, I could think of 100 jokes here, but I'll just let them all lie. So we could say that all 7 sentences are presenting evidence. But we notice that 2 sentences in particular are relating directly to the conclusion. One relating marijuana to legal drugs, and another one relating marijuana to alcohol. The rest of the sentences fall in under each of these, offering evidence for the evidence, what Toulmin called backing. So the best way to look at this is that 2 and 3 are backing for 1, while 5, 6, and 7 are backing for 4. So 2 and 3 give us reasons to believe 1, 5, 6, and 7. So 2 and 3 give us reason to believe 1. 5, 6, and 7 give us reason to believe 4. Then 1 and 4 give us reason to believe 8. It really is a very well-structured argument. Notice that you have several different kinds of evidence here, by the way. Statistics, expert testimony, maybe 1 or 2 others. It'd be a good exercise to try to figure out what they are. So we've got conclusion and evidence. Now we have to go after the warrant. To get at the warrant, we ask of the evidence, what has that got to do with anything? In other words, why should that make me believe the conclusion? Why should the evidence make me believe the conclusion? What's the connection between the evidence and the conclusion? Or to put it all more succinctly, so what? But now when we get back to this argument, we have a problem. You'll notice that all sentences have been accounted for. There are no sentences left to serve as warrant. This must mean that the warrant is unstated, implicit, within the very structure of the argument. Remember, we said that many, probably most arguments do not express their warrant outright. The arguer assumes that it is obvious to the audience and that they agree with it. To make finding the warrant easier, let's reduce this argument down to its essentials. Marijuana is much safer than other drugs. Marijuana is much safer than alcohol. Therefore, marijuana should be legalized. And we ask of the evidence, so what? Why should the fact that marijuana is safer than other drugs and alcohol make me think that it should be legalized? Well, for most of us, this probably sounds like a stupid question. It's obvious why, isn't it? And this is why the arguer didn't state the warrant explicitly. It would be wasting time, and his audience would think he thought they were idiots. But it's always a very good critical thinking practice to see if we can state clearly what seems to be obvious to us. If it's so obvious, shouldn't we be able to put it into words? Well, here's one way to state the warrant of this argument. Safety is a big deal with substances like these, but apparently drugs and alcohol are safe enough to be no worry. So marijuana will be no worry either. And notice how the warrant connects the evidence, other substances are safe, with the conclusion, marijuana should be legal. By saying that, when it comes to legal substances, safety is a big deal. By the way, this particular warrant is an analogy, the first A in gas cap. It points out an important similarity between marijuana and other legal drugs, and uses that to argue that they should be similar in another way. They're all safe, that's the similarity. In fact, marijuana is even safer than the others. So since they are legal, then marijuana should be legal too. There's no reason for them to be dissimilar in this way. So a good warrant statement will incorporate the main points of the evidence with the main point of the conclusion and connect them. As we said in week 1, warrant is the bridge between evidence and conclusion.